The rain poured heavily against the taxi's windshield, blurring the streetlights into streaks of gold and red. Daniel Myers tightened his grip on the steering wheel and sighed, watching the meter tick away for a ride that had yet to come. Another slow night. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since morning. He glanced at the crumpled $5 bill in his cup holder, just enough for a cheap coffee and maybe a sandwich if he stretched it. Things had been rough lately. Rides were inconsistent, and bills kept piling up. His landlord had already dropped a not-so-subtle hint that rent was overdue, and he was running out of excuses. Daniel took another deep breath and tried to shake off the weight pressing on his chest. He had to keep going. His radio crackled to life. Cab 14 got a pickup request corner of Maple and 5th outside the pharmacy. He grabbed the radio. Got it on my way. It was only a few blocks down. When he pulled up, he saw an older man standing under the pharmacy's awning, shielding himself from the rain. He looked frail, his gray hair plastered to his forehead, and his breathing seemed labored. The man clutched a paper bag in one hand while the other gripped his coat tightly against the cold. Daniel quickly jumped out and ran around to open the door. "Here, sir, let me help you." The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes filled with exhaustion. "Thank you, son," he murmured, his voice weak. Once the man was settled in the back seat, Daniel turned up the heater. "Where to?" The man coughed into his sleeve before answering. "Fairview Drive, just past the park." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. That was a wealthy neighborhood. He didn't ask questions, though. He just nodded and started the meter. As they drove, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The man's breathing was uneven, and he looked like he was struggling to keep his eyes open. "Are you all right, sir?" Daniel asked, concern creeping into his voice. The man gave a weak chuckle. "Just an old body reminding me I'm not as young as I used to be." He took a slow breath. "Had to pick up my medication. Thought I could manage the walk, but the rain got the best of me." Daniel frowned. The man looked like he should be in a hospital, not sitting in the back of a taxi soaked to the bone. "You live alone?" Daniel asked. The man gave a small nod. "Yes, my wife passed a few years ago. My kids are all grown, busy with their own lives." He paused, then added, "I don't like to bother them." Daniel understood that feeling all too well. He had been on his own for years now. No family to lean on, no safety net, just him and his taxi. The ride was quiet for a while, except for the sound of rain tapping against the roof. When they reached Fairview Drive, Daniel pulled up to a large house, one of those grand, old homes with a long driveway and towering oak trees. The old man fumbled for his wallet, but his hands were shaking. He struggled to pull out a bill. "Don't worry about it," Daniel said before the man could hand him anything. The man blinked. "What?" Daniel shrugged. "It's just a ride, you don't have to pay." The old man stared at him, as if trying to figure him out. "Son, I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Daniel said simply. "Just a ride." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, slowly, he put his wallet away. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with something unspoken. Daniel got out and helped the man to his front door. He noticed the man's hands were still trembling as he unlocked it. "You sure you're okay?" Daniel asked, hesitating. The old man gave him a tired smile. "I'll be fine. You've already done more than enough." Daniel nodded, then turned back toward his cab. He was soaked from the rain, his stomach still empty, and he had just given up a fare he desperately needed. But as he drove away, something about the man's gratitude made him feel lighter-like. For once, he had done something that actually mattered. What he didn't know was that this wasn't just any old man. And this small act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The rain had stopped by the time Daniel pulled back into the main streets of downtown, though the night was still damp and cold. He kept both hands on the wheel, his mind drifting back to the old man he had just dropped off. There had been something about him, something beyond the frailty and exhaustion. A quiet dignity, maybe, or perhaps it was the way he had insisted on paying, despite barely being able to keep his hands steady. Daniel shook his head and focused on the road. He couldn't afford to dwell on someone else's troubles when his own were piling up fast. His radio crackled again, calling for another ride. He accepted it and spent the next few hours picking up passengers, weaving through the city, collecting fares just enough to put gas in the tank and maybe grab a bite to eat. It was another long, unremarkable shift. But even as he worked, his thoughts kept circling back to the old man. The next night, Daniel was parked near a diner, sipping on a cheap coffee and trying to ignore the overdue bill in his pocket, when his radio sparked to life again. Cab 14, request from Fairview Drive, same pickup as last night. Daniel straightened. The old man again? He hesitated for a second before responding. On my way. As he pulled up to the familiar house, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front steps. The old man was already outside, this time leaning on a cane, dressed in a heavier coat. He looked slightly better than the night before, but there was still a weariness in the way he moved. Daniel hopped out of the cab and opened the door for him. You sure you should be out in this weather? The old man nodded as he settled into the seat. I have an appointment. Doctor doesn't like it if I miss them. His voice was stronger tonight, though still laced with fatigue. Daniel pulled away from the curb. You don't have anyone who can drive you. The old man exhaled slowly. I don't like asking for help. People have their own lives to live. Daniel understood that sentiment all too well. The drive was quiet for a few minutes before the old man spoke again. I never got your name. Daniel, he answered. Daniel Myers. Good to meet you, Daniel. I'm Richard. Daniel glanced at him in the mirror. Nice to meet you too, Richard. There was a pause before Richard spoke again. You've been driving long. A few years, Daniel replied. Pays the bills most of the time. Richard studied him for a moment. You seem like someone who's got bigger plans. Daniel let out a short laugh. Plans don't always work out. Richard nodded slowly, as if he understood that all too well. What did you want to do before this? Daniel hesitated. He hadn't talked about this in a long time. I studied business, had some ideas, but life got in the way. Richard didn't press for details, and Daniel was grateful for that. When they reached the doctor's office, Richard reached for his wallet again, but Daniel shook his head. Don't worry about it. Richard gave him a long look. You can't keep doing that, son. Daniel shrugged. It's just a ride. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he stepped out of the cab with a thoughtful expression. Daniel expected that to be the last time he saw him, but over the next week, Richard kept calling for rides. Sometimes to the doctor, sometimes to the pharmacy, sometimes just to get out of the house for a little while. Each time, their conversations grew longer. Daniel learned that Richard had once run a company, a big one, though he never named it. He had built it from the ground up, worked hard for decades, and then retired when his health started to decline. His wife had passed shortly after, and now he lived alone in the big house on Fairview Drive. His children visited occasionally, but not often enough for his liking. Richard never complained, but Daniel could hear the loneliness in his voice. One evening, after dropping Richard off, Daniel sat in his cab a little longer than usual. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to struggle quietly, not wanting to be a burden to anyone. The next time Richard called for a ride, Daniel brought 2 cups of coffee with him, one for himself, one for Richard. Richard looked surprised when Daniel handed it to him. What's this? Figured you could use one, Daniel said, starting the car. Richard stared at the cup for a long moment before smiling. You remind me of someone I used to know. Daniel didn't ask who. They drove in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens when two people understand each other without needing to say much. And just like that, what had started as a simple cab ride became something more. A quiet companionship between two men from different worlds, both carrying their own burdens. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to change in ways neither could have predicted. Daniel pulled up to Richard's house once again, his headlights casting long shadows across the driveway. Over the past few weeks, their routine had become almost predictable. Richard would call for a ride, Daniel would show up, and they'd talk about everything from the state of the city to old memories Richard would occasionally share. But tonight felt different. Richard looked more tired than usual as he made his way to the cab, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Daniel stepped out to help him into the car, noticing how slow his movements had become. "Rough day?" Daniel asked once they were on the road. Richard exhaled, his fingers lightly drumming against his knee. "Just one of those days where the body doesn't quite cooperate," he admitted. "Getting old isn't for the weak." Daniel nodded. He had gotten used to the way Richard spoke, never complaining outright, but never sugarcoating things either. They drove in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between them. Richard was usually the one to initiate their conversations, but tonight he seemed lost in thought. Daniel decided to break the silence. "What's on your mind?" Richard glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur past. "Do you ever think about what you'll leave behind?" Daniel wasn't sure how to answer that. "I guess, haven't thought about it much." Richard nodded slowly. "I built something from nothing, spent decades making sure it survived, but now I don't know if any of it really matters." Daniel frowned. "You ran a business, that counts for something, doesn't it?" Richard gave a small chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "It does, or at least it did. But when you take away the company, the money, the meetings, what's left? Just an old man trying to get through the day." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He had never thought about life that way. He had spent so much time just trying to survive that he had never considered what came after that. Richard leaned back in his seat. "I had a friend once," he said. "A business partner. He used to say that everything we build is temporary, but the people we help, that's what lasts." Daniel glanced at him. "Sounds like a wise man." Richard smiled faintly. He was. They arrived at Richard's destination, and Daniel parked the car. Before Richard could reach for his wallet, Daniel shook his head. "I told you before, it's just a ride." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Daniel shrugged. "I know enough." Richard seemed to consider that. Then he nodded. "That's rare these days." Daniel didn't think much of it at the time. He just watched as Richard slowly made his way inside before pulling away from the curb. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. Daniel was parked near a gas station, checking his nearly empty fuel gauge when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered hesitantly. "Hello." "Is this Daniel Myers?" The voice on the other end was professional, calm. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Evelyn Carter. I work for Richard Langston." Daniel sat up straighter. "Richard?" "Yes, he's asked to see you. Would you be available to come by his home this evening?" Daniel hesitated. Richard had never called him outside of requesting a ride. Something about this felt different. Yeah, I can do that." "Good, he'll be expecting you." The call ended, leaving Daniel staring at his phone in confusion. That evening, he made his way to Richard's house, unsure of what to expect. When he arrived, the front door was slightly open, as if someone had been waiting for him. He stepped inside cautiously. Richard was seated in a large armchair in the living room, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up as Daniel entered. "Glad you came," Richard said. Daniel nodded slowly. "You wanted to see me." Richard gestured for him to sit. "I think it's time we had a real conversation." Daniel took a seat, his curiosity growing. Richard tapped the papers in front of him. "I've spent a long time watching people, seeing what they do when no one's looking. You're different." Daniel frowned. "Different how?" "You didn't help me because you thought I was someone important. You didn't ask for anything in return. That's rare." Daniel shrugged uncomfortably. "I was just doing what felt right." Richard nodded approvingly. "And that's exactly why I want to help you." Daniel blinked. "Help me." Richard leaned forward slightly. "I know about your situation. You're struggling, but you're not the kind of man who lets that define him. That's why I want to offer you something." Daniel's heart pounded. He wasn't sure what Richard was leading to, but he could feel the weight of the moment. Richard gestured to the papers again. "I built something from nothing once, and I see that same drive in you. I want to give you an opportunity, something real, a job, a good one." Daniel stared at him, his mind racing. "Why?" Richard smiled faintly. "Because sometimes the right people deserve a chance." Daniel sat there, stunned, as Richard pushed the papers toward him. His life was about to change forever. Daniel stared at the papers in front of him. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Richard Langston, an old man he had simply helped without expecting anything in return, was offering him a job. A real job. This is a lot," Daniel admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Richard studied him, his expression calm but expectant. "I imagine it is, but I want you to take your time, read over everything." Daniel hesitated before picking up the first page. His eyes skimmed over the fine print, his pulse quickening when he saw the details. It wasn't just any job, it was a managerial role at a well-established company, the kind of position that people worked years to attain. The salary alone was more than he had ever made in a year combined, and there were benefits, actual benefits. He swallowed hard. "Why me?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Because I see something in you. You remind me of the kind of man I used to be before the world hardened me. You helped me without knowing who I was, without expecting a single thing in return. That says more about your character than any resume ever could." Daniel shook his head slightly, still struggling to process it. "I don't even have the right background for this. I never finished school. I've been driving a cab for years. Why give this to me when there's probably 100 other people more qualified?" Richard gave a slow nod, as if he had expected this reaction. "Because qualifications can be taught. Character, however, that's something you either have or you don't, and I've seen enough to know you have it." Daniel looked down at the papers again, his fingers tightening around the edges. He could barely breathe. This opportunity, it was more than just a job. It was a chance to rebuild his life, to get out of the cycle he had been stuck in for so long. Richard's voice softened. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. Take these home, think about it. But know this, when you drove me home that night without asking for payment, you reminded me of something I had forgotten. That kindness still exists, even when it's not convenient. That's why I want to help you. Consider this my way of paying it forward." Daniel sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Eventually, he nodded, gripping the papers tightly as if afraid they might disappear. "I'll think about it." Richard smiled slightly. "That's all I ask." Daniel left the house that night feeling like he was walking in a dream. The papers felt heavy in his hands, a tangible representation of how quickly life could change. He sat in his cab for a long time before finally driving home, his thoughts racing too fast to focus on the road ahead. For the first time in a long while, it felt like there was a real path forward. Daniel sat at his small kitchen table, the job offer spread out before him. The edges of the papers curled slightly from his grip, his mind still struggling to believe they were real. He had spent years scraping by, taking whatever work he could find, never expecting a break like this. Now it was right in front of him. But doubt crept in. Could he really do this? He had been out of the corporate world for too long. His experience was limited, and the weight of responsibility attached to this job loomed large. What if he failed? What if Richard had misjudged him? He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. He needed advice. The next morning, instead of calling Richard, he drove back to Fairview Drive. When Richard's house came into view, Daniel felt a wave of hesitation. But before he could talk himself out of it, he knocked on the door. Richard answered, his expression neutral but observant. "Didn't expect to see you this early." Daniel held up the papers. "I have questions." Richard stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. They moved to the sitting room, where Daniel set the papers down on the table between them. "I don't want to waste your time," Daniel began, "but I need to understand this. Why now? Why me? You said you saw something in me, but what if you're wrong?" Richard leaned back in his chair, considering Daniel's words carefully. "I don't make decisions lightly. I've spent my life reading people, knowing who to trust and who to avoid, and I trust you." Daniel frowned, "But I don't have the experience." "That's where you're wrong," Richard interrupted. "You've spent years navigating unpredictable situations, dealing with people from all walks of life. Driving a cab isn't just about getting from one place to another. You've learned patience, problem solving, and how to handle difficult conversations. That's more than most people walking into an office job for the first time can claim." Daniel looked down, absorbing the words. He had never thought of his work in that way before. Richard continued, his voice steady. "Besides, I wouldn't be throwing you into this without support. You'd have guidance, training. I'm not handing you something you can't handle, I'm giving you something I know you can grow into." Daniel let out a slow breath, the weight of uncertainty starting to shift. "And if I fail?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Then you learn from it, but I don't think you will." The confidence in his voice struck Daniel. Richard wasn't offering this as charity, he genuinely believed he was capable. For the first time in a long while, Daniel let himself believe it too. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood in the lobby of the company Richard had founded decades ago. The polished floors, the quiet hum of business in the air, it was a world he had never been part of, but now he was stepping into it. The transition wasn't easy. The first few weeks were overwhelming, filled with long hours of learning, adjusting, and pushing himself in ways he never had before. But Richard had been right. His years of dealing with people, with problems on the fly, had prepared him more than he realized. And he wasn't alone. Richard checked in regularly, offering advice, sometimes just listening. Their conversations had shifted from simple cab rides to discussions about leadership, decision-making, and how to handle challenges. One evening, after a particularly long day, Daniel found himself back at Richard's house. They sat outside on the patio, the air cool and crisp. "You were right," Daniel admitted, "about everything." Richard gave a small nod. "I usually am." Daniel chuckled. "I never would have taken this leap if you hadn't pushed me." Richard looked out at the trees lining his yard. Sometimes, people just need someone to remind them of what they are capable of. Daniel thought about that for a moment. "And what about you? What's next?" Richard exhaled, a hint of weariness in his posture. "I think it's time to step back. Fully this time. I've spent enough years building things. Now, I want to enjoy whatever time I have left." Daniel studied him, alone. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Maybe not. Daniel didn't press. He had learned that Richard revealed things in his own time. As they sat there, Daniel realized how much had changed in just a short time. He had gone from barely scraping by to standing on solid ground, not just financially, but in a way that mattered more. He had purpose. And it had all started with a single decision to help someone without expecting anything in return. As the evening stretched on, the weight of the past few months settled into something lighter. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't afraid of it. Because he wasn't walking into it alone.